Right, welcome everybody back to the third episode of the Scotland Stoics podcast. We're starting to get a bit of a cult following now. I've had messages from people in America, Canada, and obviously Bonnie, Scotland. So welcome everybody. Tonight's guest is Erland. Erland, can you pronounce your second name? Because I'm not very good at that.
I can, yeah. MacGillivray.
MacGillivray. Yeah,
Silent second I, but yeah, it's not as hard as it looks.
No, I see that. It's just that my pronunciation.
All the vowels there, yeah.
Pronunciation has never been the best. That was what happens when you didn't go to school when you were younger and started to learn the little older you got, you know. But thanks for that anyway. I'm going to give a wee brief introduction to who you are. I see, Erland, you're just bringing out a book now, which we're going to discuss. Is the book already out just now, yeah?
It is. It arrived last week. I think in the UK it's coming out in 2 weeks' time, but in the States, or I got an advance. So that's what it is. So yeah, I think the States, North America rather, it's coming out. But yeah, that's it.
Yeah,
Shortly.
and the pronunciation of the book is the Epictetus and Lay people.
Yeah.
Yep. And it looks at the Stoic stance towards non-Stoics, yes, and Stoic understanding and how philosophers could make moral progress. Yes, is that about right?
Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. Yeah.
Interesting, mate. So we'll go into a few questions about that soon. First and foremost, we'll talk about a wee bit of personal things. That's what we like to do in the Scotland Stoics podcast. We like to get to know our guests before we start talking about philosophy and that. I see that you're an academic, completing your PhD in Aberdeen just now, yes. And also, which I find very interesting, is that you're also doing a professor in Manila, yeah? How did that come about?
Yeah, I was for a while. Basically, the Aberdeen department had a few links out there. I think since the 1980s, they've been sending some academics out there. So I ended up going there. That was at least a couple of years ago now. So I was there for about 6 months, which was interesting. Yeah, I loved it. I think I see there's quite a few Stoics in the Philippines now. I seem to notice I haven't tried to connect with any of them, but I've seen them on Donald Robinson's Stoic group coming quite a bit. So I think they even have a meeting in Manila now, which is excellent to see, because when I was there, looking around the libraries rather, it tended to be, if they had any classical philosophy, it was Aristotle. So it's good to see the Stoics are getting a foothold there as well. But yeah, I was there, and then I completed my PhD in Aberdeen over a year ago, and then this is basically the outcome of it, in part anyway. So yeah.
That's interesting. Ellen, before we go on to start talking about the book, I've just got a couple of personal questions to ask you. Could you please tell us what was the thing that got you into philosophy, and how's the journey been like for you since you've turned over to philosophy?
I got into it. It was well, I did humanities at university, and I've always been that way minded, really. I suppose because philosophy is very versatile, and I was just aware when I started getting lectures on philosophy, it was incredibly interesting, and you could take it all sorts of different ways, depending on what your interest, your inclinations are. I know people who are really enthused by logic, and they'll study logic, for all ends, which is very interesting. I do enjoy that, but and you can look at the university we had with people looking at philosophy of quantum mechanics and all that stuff, which goes above my head, but I think it's I get the sense it's all very important and tells us about perhaps underlying reality. But then, well, as I'm sure you and all your guests will know, it helps us learn how to live, be moral, and I think Stoicism appealed to me because I think, well, the overlaps with cognitive behavioral therapy, which has obviously flown out of it. It helped me. I was not in any serious or a clinical way, but perturbed by obsessive kind of anxiety thoughts, which many people are. And that helped. It's like stuff I'm learning in university, I can use this in my own life, which isn't often, particularly within university settings, perhaps, that this is really, really useful in my own life, and I can share this with others, etc. So I think that's what hooked me, and you can talk about all sorts of things, all topics really relate, feed into philosophy and feed out of it. So yeah, that's basically why.
No, I find that very interesting. Actually, I had similar experiences with anxiety myself, and I felt that I actually went to see a CBT therapist, and it was interesting to recognise that that's the cornerstone of how that came about was from actually
Definitely.
Stoicism, which was
Yeah.
remarkable.
Yeah.
We've got another host on tonight, so Colin's on. So Colin, can you ask Erland a question, please?
Sure thing. Erland, you've kind of touched on it a little bit there already, but can you tell me the research that you've conducted in your sort of academic career, how that's shaped your everyday life?
It's well, I think particularly what I'm saying, and I think why many people are drawn to Stoicism, I suppose, today, not exclusively, but because of that therapeutic aspect, if we want to call it that you can control, well, for example, anxiety, which I don't know anyone who wouldn't get anxious, and we live in anxious times, and that can help us provide a framework in which we can approach that. Basically, that's the kind of the key way in which I find it useful. That has shaped my life, and tried to share it with others. Epictetus will say, and I cover it in my book, as much as he is very interested in people learn, and he emphasizes this, learn Stoicism in a scholarly way, it can be shared at least passively. And one of his students comes and says, my mother's very, very perturbed. I'm living away from home. And of course, in those days, if you're across one side of the Mediterranean, that's, it can take months before you can even send a letter, let alone, Zoom call. And Epictetus basically implies, well, just share some not witticisms, but share some quotes. Help your mother out. Share some stories. Basically, trying to say you shouldn't place your value. You should understand that your son very well may move away, and don't place your hopes and expectations that he won't. You can't. That's not within your control, etc. So yeah.
Great, thank you. Is there any other ancient philosophers that you've researched or studied that have had an impact on you personally?
Seneca on anger. I would readily just kind of hand out that book to anyone. I think it's just come out in the is it Harvard? They're publishing their little ancient guides to various things, and their one on anger, Seneca. I have once handed even to people who aren't interested in Stoicism, just wouldn't care or grasp it. I think particularly that work. I think it does speak to everyone. I think actually Seneca on anger. In terms of my academic studies, I also it hasn't really impacted my life, but I actually first of all started studying Epicureanism. So my first published work in ancient philosophy was looking at Epicureanism, which will feed into the book. I was looking to see whether they evangelized, whether they proselytized around the ancient world. So that was one of my first getting to grips with ancient philosophy, was with Epicureanism, which is another rich philosophical movement. But I really just restricted myself to looking at whether, or I call it mission, Epicurean mission. But yeah.
Great, thanks very much. Thank you.
And the next question is going to come from myself. What does a typical week look like for an academic researching philosophy in, say, Aberdeen or Manila? And does that include the teachings of Stoicism within your work?
Within it would depend exactly what your position is. There's myself, I was fortunate enough to get an arts and humanities grant, which basically meant all I was allowed to do was research. I could do a little bit of teaching, but not too much. It was stipulated in the contract that they give you money and they want you to just do your research and try and do it well. Within it will probably be different in different universities. It will really depend what faculty you have, what's taught. It's very much molded around that. The curious thing within Aberdeen, and then I'll maybe get back to what my working week looks like. For some reason, as a university that doesn't no longer, I think since 1982 or something, doesn't have a classics faculty, and the philosophy faculty doesn't look at ancient philosophy. They're very much just looking at contemporary philosophy. For whatever reason, we have a strange cohort of Stoic scholars that have come out of Aberdeen. Donald Robertson, of course, Aberdeen graduate. There's myself, obviously much less known and much less impactful. But there's also Joey Dodson, which some of your viewers might know. He's particularly written on Seneca, Seneca and the Apostle Paul, but he's got quite a few books out, including some introductory or overview books, which are actually quite useful. He graduated from Aberdeen, and there's been, I found in the catalogues, at least 2 other people who have done doctoral work on Stoicism, which is perhaps unusual, given that we don't have a classics faculty. So I don't know, something in the northern cold climate makes us naturally Stoic, perhaps. I don't know, but there we are. In terms of a day-to-day, I was just researching. I covered Stoicism briefly when I was kind of doing some classes on early history. I don't know to what extent in the UK it's taught that much, at least by dedicated scholars of Stoicism. There's a course down in Royal Holloway. You've got John Sellers and Liz Gloyn. Apart from that, I think in Scotland, I think it's just Alex Long in St Andrews does a little bit, but apart from that, it's not heavily. Still, Plato and Aristotle kind of dominate, at least academically. I think in the general public, I think Stoicism is probably more profusely spread out, I think.
Absolutely, I agree with that completely. Colin, you want to ask the next question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, when we're going to talk about your book in a little minute, but how did you go about researching that? Did you look at ancient texts yourself, or were you looking at already translated texts? How did that all work?
Pardon me. I decided to get into particularly Stoicism because there's this kind of a general lack of studies, and within academia, what you want is books or topics or authors that people have unwarrantedly ignored, because then you can come in and then you can do your contribution. So you're meant to create something new, basically novel idea that they can award your postgraduate degree in. So Stoicism was one of that. I know a lot of my colleagues, for example, were studying the New Testament, and they're looking at the history, all sorts of things related to that. And if you're to look at the New Testament on a shelf, I mean, it's depending on the binding, it's about that kind of width or something. I think I collected all the ancient Stoic writings that I could, including some kind of more obscure ones like Chaeremon and etc. And at the time, there wasn't an English translation of Musonius Rufus. And I put it on the shelf next, and it was about, and with Epictetus, Seneca, and etc., and Marcus Aurelius, and all the minor Stoics as well. It was about this on my bookshelf, but the amount of effort that was going into work that was this big. Obviously, it's had a big impact in the New Testament, obviously, but I thought, no, I bet you I could find a really interesting topic that I love and that no one's talked about, and I did, and that was great. I liked Epictetus as well because I was taught Koine Greek, so he's a much more easy. If anyone's looking to get into Greek, start with Epictetus, I would say, rather than say Marcus. Well, Marcus Aurelius is okay, but some of the Hierocles, for example, would be quite complex. But Epictetus, he's the records are, of course, in a everyday setting in a school. It's not polished Greek, so I like that. I could read it without too much bother. So that was another pool, not a less kind of profound reason, but that was another reason I started looking at Epictetus.
Okay, great, thanks. Right, Bob?
Right, obviously now we're going to go into the book now, Erland, right? Now, what I was just reading there, one of the reviews I've got up in the questions here is obviously from Massimo, right? Massimo was our first ever guest, so to get a good review for him is excellent. And the review says this: This new study on Epictetus is a must-read for anyone intrigued by the influential practical philosophy of this ancient Roman sage. Not bad there, getting a wee shout out to Massimo, is it, Erland?
I know. I was delighted when I saw he did that. So yeah, if he comes to Scotland, I don't know if you're watching this, but yeah, I owe you a beverage of his choice, Massimo. Yeah, definitely.
When he was on a few weeks ago, he did say that he visited Scotland in 2014 during the independence referendum. So he's been here before. So let's hope he makes another appearance soon and we can all get a wee catch up with him. That would be good, wouldn't it?
It would be good, yeah. Particularly in the post-pandemic, we can all get together. That would be good.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you a question, right, related to the book. So the book covers a topic that's previously escaped serious research and study. Did you discover anything new about Epictetus while researching for this book?
I think quite a few things. Some of them less profound than others. Some things I found some quotes he was making to some Greek plays that people weren't aware he was doing. I kind of honed the scholarly view on his understanding of the civic law, civic religion. I think he's a bit more positive than people think. I have an article which came out that in part feeds into the book, but also isn't. But which is published. Managed to get it published open access, so anyone can read it, on divination. So he's stereotypically been seen as being against divination, which would put him decidedly at odds with almost every other Stoic, I think, apart from Panaetius. But I argued, and at least the journal reviewers thought that I made a compelling case that he was for divination and believed in divination, which, as I say, almost every Stoic that we know of would. I don't think that doesn't affect me personally. I don't obviously believe in divination, but in terms of as a historian, that's of interest to me. Another thing that isn't in the book, but I'm starting work on my next book. So when that's out, if you can hopefully have me back, and it's more of a general look at Epictetus and his life and world, and a little bit less academic. But I think the place where we say he was born is wrong. I think he was actually born about 100 miles north from Hierapolis. So that came up in my research. Basically, there is an area north of Hierapolis which is called Epictetus. The region is called Phrygia Epictetus, and I think my hunch is a lot Roman masters would quite often, they weren't terribly inventive with slave names. They would just give you what they called an ethnonym, which means I'm just going to call you where you're from. So if you have someone from Thrace, you just call them Thracian, something like that. I have a hunch that Epictetus was born 100 miles north of Hierapolis in the region that is called Epictetus. That's my argument. The reason people say Hierapolis is the Suda says Epictetus of Hierapolis. It doesn't actually say born in Hierapolis. I think it's just linking him with either the nearest biggest city. So, for example, to North Americans or people abroad, I might say, I'm from Edinburgh. I'm actually north in Dunfermline, but I'm not expecting them to necessarily know about Dunfermline. But I'll say Edinburgh, and they're like, okay, I know Edinburgh. I think it might be an ancient version of that. So perhaps the Suda's linking him with the biggest city, or he moved from Epictetus as a very kind of rural I shouldn't say backward, rural area. So perhaps he was born there, named from there, but then he moved to the big city, Hierapolis. So if I'm right, we might need to rewrite the Wikipedia page, etc. But I think if scholars accept that, I think that would probably be my biggest contribution, changing the birthplace of Epictetus.
It's very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. I didn't know that at all. Really good stuff. Do you want to ask a question, Colin?
I actually had a hunch about Epictetus being born there as well, but I didn't want to tell anybody. So the title of your book is Epictetus and Lay People. Can you sort of briefly sum up what you actually mean by a lay person in your book?
Yeah, so the first chapter is really looking at that. It's it's probably what most people think. I think if you hear lay person, someone who isn't knowledgeable about Stoicism. That said, and this can be obscured in some English translations, um, uh, he also includes as a layperson someone who might know Stoicism but doesn't put it into practice. So he would say that they're the word is idiotes, a layperson. So it's not just people who don't know, but that would probably be the primary sense of the word. People just don't know Stoicism or don't understand it. They're a layperson. But it would also include people who actually, in some instances, have a very, very in-depth knowledge of Stoicism, uh, but don't practice it and don't, or it's just words to them, which of course is a key concern for Epictetus, right? That people aren't just uh, outwardly professing Stoicism, but that they're actually he's a teacher, right? So he's trying to make sure the students are actually following what he says, not just knowing what learning what he's saying, but doing what he's saying. So he would also include that as a lay person. That wouldn't be so much, I think, today. Obviously, in the ancient world, there was a certain cachet, a certain honor, if you say you're a philosopher, particularly in the eastern part of the empire. So you had a phenomenon of people who would say, "Oh yes, I'm a Stoic," or whatever philosophy, just to get people's admiration and respect. So that's as well. In the book, I then focus on the people who don't know, who don't know Stoicism, and what Epictetus thinks of them. The reason I focused on that is he mentions them all the time. I think I calculated about almost 100 times he will directly or obliquely or indirectly talk about them, and there's been pretty much no analysis done of what he actually thinks about them. But he talks about them once you have that in your mind when you're reading him, you'll notice it everywhere, in amongst all the really great advice about Stoicism and how to live your life, etc. You just see it's suffused throughout his writings. But so this was what I found when I'm looking for, okay, where's the area that hasn't been studied? Where am I going to latch on? That was it.
Great, and I guess that leads us straight into the next question quite nicely.
Yep. So the next question we were going to ask is, what does Epictetus think about non-philosophers, and what is his view? What is his view typical of other Stoics and philosophers of the day? So there's a lot to chew in there.
Yeah. I might take it in one direction. I might looking back and take it in another. His view of non-philosophers. Well, let me start by broadly saying what philosophy as a whole, so pretty much the ancient philosophical view, pretty much across the schools. It was a general, and I'm not saying exclusive, but generally the domain of the leisured elites, mainly. There are examples where, of course, it isn't. Cleanthes was a water carrier, etc. Epictetus was a slave, and I think that is important. He obviously wasn't born in the leisured elite, and he will reference quite often events in slavery that were degrading, etc. That said, I mean, he was a member of Epaphroditus was Nero's pretty much closest advisor. He was the person who actually helped Nero kill himself, Epaphroditus. He was right at the tip of the pyramid, and he can reference that. So he was a slave, but I don't think he wasn't like dirt poor and not taught. He was probably Epaphroditus probably made sure Epictetus was thoroughly literate, which most people weren't. But anyway, in general, all the terms, and in the book I go through some of the terms for lay people, they're all quite derogatory. So there's it's a group identity, basically, as if you're a philosopher, and that sets you apart from others. And there's a Greek concept called paideia, which basically incorporates education and culture and standing, etc. And that sets you apart from the common people. And there is this very much distinguishing view, and I analyze it from both. Actually, I analyze it from philosophers who say all these, idiots. The Greek word for layperson is idiotes, as it has now come to mean idiots. But There's all these people, and they're silly, and they don't know what they're doing, and they're foolish, etc. And then vice versa. I got I don't know over 10 texts or something that reference lay people in return, going, well, Buhis, you think we're also foolish. We think that you're kind of ridiculous, and you're just stuck in books and analysing nonsense. So there was a kind of, as much as philosophy was also respected, there was a kind of to and fro between these two groups, the philosophers and the lay people, of at least mildly kind of ribbing each other to some extent. Within Stoicism, you do see this firm kind of dichotomy, of course, well, between the wise and the non-wise, but it's part of it. That's part of the cultural milieu in which Stoicism is within, and they'll quite often contrast, well, the wise person and the foolish people. And on the one hand, if you're just reading through Epictetus, you might think, well, Epictetus is great, but he is a little bit snobbish towards the lay people, so he'll come up with all sorts of adjectives, not particularly nice adjectives to describe lay people, and you could perhaps that's the first thing you might notice. It was for me. I thought, well, he really, really doesn't like them. He just thinks they're silly, and all they exist for really is just to warn his students, don't be like the silly, foolish people. And he's full of warnings, right? So he'll say, be careful if you talk about Stoicism, because you'll probably get your face punched in. Watch it. And there's loads of these comments throughout his writings. And he says, watch if you speak with laymen, and he'll say this a few times, if you're at dinner parties, he's talking to young students, and they're getting enthused about Stoicism, and he's like, just watch it, you're going to get punched in the face. And he even says himself, he says, I used to do this when I was in Rome. I suspect when he was a young student or something, I would go around, and he gives this dialogue where he meets a senator, basically, and at the end of it, he gets punched in the face. So there's that sense, and that kind of feeds into the, beware, they're the other, they're the foolish other people, beware of them. So that probably covers that. But then I go on, and I kind of more shade in the colors to that black and white, and actually I think he does have something quite positive to say about lay people, but I don't know if that's do you want to talk about that now, or carry on that theme, or
No, carry on, Luke, please. Yep.
Okay, so that's basically the rest of the book. Well, I look at his idea of mission. As I said, I looked at Epicureanism. I think they did, for whatever reason, the ancient school that was most active in trying to spread their message were the Epicureans. So you have Diogenes of Eandia. It's the largest known inscription in the whole of antiquity. It's basically an appeal in a small village in Turkey to say, look at Epicureanism. I don't know why. The most simplest texts we have of ancient philosophy are Epicurean. These purposely made it for lay people to understand Epicureanism. So that was my first academic look at philosophy. I looked at Stoicism. I didn't really find that within Stoicism, but again, that's just almost all schools, apart from within Epicureanism, and even then, actually, some Epicureans weren't happy with that. But anyway, I didn't find any overt attempts to spread the philosophy broadly in terms of producing simplified texts or creating like massive inscriptions. That said, one of the earlier references we have to Epictetus, outside of Epictetus's own, Arian's own recollections, is Origen, the early Christian father, church father. Basically said Christianity attracts everyone: slaves, the illiterate, laborers, boxers, basically the people in the street, unlike philosophy. But then he kind of stops himself, and then he says, apart from Epictetus, he is read by everyone, which we think is probably the Enchiridion. That is a simplified text. So I think Stoicism probably did spread through the Enchiridion, and you have Christians saying, well, we spread everywhere. And of course Epictetus spreads everywhere as well. But in terms of his views of lay people, so I set up in the opening chapter, he's quite sniffy about them, as if you know ancient philosophers, you would expect them to be a bit sniffy about lay people. But then the rest of the chapters after I look at mission, and then I'm just pulling up my table of contents page, um, I find he does have a concern for lay people, and he will mention them a lot, and often quite positively. But he thinks preconceptions, which is basically it's kind of debated within Stoicism, but Epictetus uniquely seems to think we're innate. Everyone, it seems, is innately predisposed anyway, if not actually has the seeds of the knowledge of moral categories. So you can know, for example, justice is right, exploitation is wrong. Of course, in the nitty-gritty of that, the fine-grained analysis of, well, what is right and wrong, what is justice and injustice, what is exploitation, etc., that's where philosophy comes in. But at least as a broad category, everyone has that understanding. We're just preconception. We're just either born with that knowledge in us, or we are born that we will ultimately always come to reason in that way or think in that way, where we have right moral categories. I don't in the book. I can't remember. I don't think I call it a conscience, because that might entail some other ideas. But it's almost like a proto-conscience. So he thinks lay people are guided by these preconceptions, and actually, in at least one place, he actually says to a person who visits the school, you know what? Look to your preconceptions. You actually will know what I'm going to tell you, at least broadly. In the detail, you don't, and you do need philosophy. But broadly, you actually already know this, what I'm going to say, right? So seek justice, not injustice. But in at least a few examples I find, he actually raises this to say, look, lay people to some extent have been able to act rightly and have to some extent think rightly. Why? Because we're all given preconceptions. Then I look at civic religion and civic law. I talked a little bit about divination. He thinks divination can help people. I actually think he thinks, well, he does think a lot of the key philosophers in the ancient world, for him, were called to philosophy through divination, and he thinks the oracles, for example, are calling people. You know thyself, the famous call to know thyself, engage in philosophy. He thinks that is actually intended to call everyone to philosophy, at least in theory. And oracles and divinations can help in that. Obviously, this is a very different context from today, but nevertheless, that's one reason. He thinks the some stories within Greco-Roman religion are moral and useful and help, and it's a means apart from Stoicism where people can be benefited. And he talks about that. The lay people, yeah, they're foolish, but there are some things in Greco-Roman religion they respond to. Civic law is another one, and again, he thinks through the law, actually people can be positively inclined to think rightly. And he brings up some of his friends, Agrippinus, for example, who was at Crete, he was the governor of, and he said he used his governorship and the law to help people. There's no way that he would directly try and tell them to become Stoics, but he used the law. And actually, there's I'm sure many of your viewers know of Jim Stockdale, or have heard, at least in passing, Jim Stockdale, the was he an admiral or something like that, fighter pilot in the Vietnam War. He tells a story, and it's actually made me think, as much as perhaps we might want Epictetus to say, spread the message wide and make everyone a Stoic. So I was dealing with that, and then I was reading Jim Stockdale's little book about philosophy and how it impacted him when he was being tortured in Vietnam prisons. And of course, if there's anywhere you think Stoicism might be needed, it would be in a prison torture cell in Vietnam and your American pilots and soldiers. But there's a portion in the book, actually, where Jim Stockdale says, no, I don't do that. I don't try and make them Stoics, or actually even try and tell them about Stoicism. And it's interesting. because he's a little bit defensive about it, but it matches exactly what Epictetus says, because he says, I did try that, and people just throw it back in my face. But doesn't mean I don't care about them. What I do is I model it, and they see from my actions, and then they respond. But if I start kind of preaching at them and, oh, did you know there's a philosophy? You're like, oh, come on, I'm being tortured, and you want to start, lecturing me about philosophy, like yawns, that kind of thing. And I thought that's interesting. That's actually mirroring exactly what Epictetus, is his advice. And Jim Stockdale didn't link it with Epictetus. I don't know whether he noticed that, or again, it's kind of an ignored topic, but that's exactly Epictetus's stance, which Jim Stockdale, either through Epictetus or just through his own experience, it directly parallels. If you directly do it, I tended to find people get angry at me. If I model it and show them it, they pick it up, or some people do. Anyway, talking about modeling, that then leads me into my final chapter, which was Exempla. Exempla was a key way in Roman education and in Greek education. Basically, you model yourself after people, either in literature or in your family, or even people around you in contemporary life. And Epictetus actually even includes slaves and laborers in that category. Look around you at the slaves and the laborers and the boxers. And he says this a few times, which I actually, and again, it hasn't been commented on. I think that's actually striking. Epictetus has been within, as I say, the very tip of the pyramid of the social structure of the Roman Empire. The people he's talking to, and I explore this in the book, are without doubt, again, people if not at the very tip, almost at the very tip of Roman social structure. They all were brought up with nurses and pedagogues, and they go hunting and gymnastics and the theatre, and one of their main concerns is, perhaps Caesar will put me when I'm a governor to a really kind of desolate place, and that won't be fun, and the Roman baths won't be very nice, and my father won't give me the full inheritance of all the estates. That's the kind of thing that Epictetus is dealing with, not the how can I feed myself kind of segment of society. But he says to these quite young, very elite people, and actually, I remember he also talks about students who will complain and say, "Oh, I wonder if Caesar's fallen out with me." And then he even I love when he puts the dialogues from the students and he rehearses what they say to each other. You can just imagine him listening to their conversations before or after class, talking about basically, my dad's bigger than your dad. Well, my dad did this. My dad's a friend of Caesar. That's the context. Anyway, and he says to these people, look at the slaves, look at the laborers, see what they're doing, see how they mirror it. The Christians as well. Epictetus is, after Josephus and contemporaneous with Pliny, he's one of the earliest people who mentions Christians, what we think, Galileans. And he says as well, and again, this is surprising, talking to elite, you're talking about a very obscure, again, very lower class, held in some disdain movement, and says, look at them. There are all these lower class people and people who we kind of look down on. Somehow they're looking at, or they're gaining their some sense of moral and some understanding. How I then understand that, and apologies if I'm talking too much, but this is kind of the category in which, or the schema which I think it works. If you look at Stoic ideas of early humanity, they think no one understood philosophy, or perhaps just very, very few people. But it worked because there was less corruption in society, and our preconceptions were able to make us behave correctly. And Seneca's very much is on this. Philosophy only becomes needed later in human history when we're surrounded by vice. But the natural state of everyone is to obey their preconceptions, and we behave correctly, and we don't actually need philosophy. Now we do, because there's so much vice everywhere, misunderstanding. We definitely need it. But originally, no, we don't. We have preconceptions, and they have some. It's letter 92, 93. Seneca also talks about the law. After that stage, you then have the law and religion, and these can help people suffice to go on without philosophy to some extent, at least. So yeah, that's the category in which they work. They think originally people didn't actually even need philosophy. It's only sadly that we need it later on.
That's really interesting. It's absolutely fantastic, some of the things you were covering there. That kind of leads us on to the next question I've seen about surrounded by vice. So, Colin, do you want to ask the next question, please?
I think you've already you have already answered it. I was going to ask, is there anything that modern Stoics or anyone could take away from your findings? You've spoken about walking the walk rather than talking the talk. I think that's certainly something when I've been talking about Stoicism to people and they look at you a wee bit funny sometimes, but also then when you're acting or behaving in a manner that a Stoic would, they notice that more and pay more attention. So you touched on that and the modelling or looking for role models. You also touched on that as well. Is there anything else in the book that is a takeaway for someone, a modern Stoic, let's say, apart from those two things, which are biggies?
I think, well, shouldn't surprise us. Epictetus took it very, very, very seriously and expected everyone else, his students certainly, to take it very, very seriously. As some of his advice, which I wouldn't necessarily say we should take in today's context necessarily. You know, even watch who you're being friends with; they might drag you down. That's how seriously he was telling them. Like, watch who you're with and where you're going. This is the most important thing. And he uses the metaphor of a ship's captain, basically, where you're driving a ship, and of course you're at the wheel and etc., the rudder, and you know, one false move, and before you know it, you've crashed. You just look away, and then you're not on the wheel, and you can crash instantaneously. And he, a few times, at least two times, he references students. I think quite well. He's as a warning anyway. He's referencing students who have left. They start for a while and then they go off, and he says. They've exchanged their love for Chrysippus for basically the Roman equivalent of silly, smutty romance novelists, because they just couldn't handle it, or something like that. So I suppose to be it's a serious thing, and it does call for dedication. It's not, Epictetus chides people who just look for an occasional little quote and then they just kind of move on, and that's it. He's very, very critical of that. So I think if you're expecting the Stoicism to work, it's not just like one of these nice little quote books you see in like you know, the tourist shops around that you can get like inspiring quotes and you dip in and get a warm feeling and then move on. It is something that takes work if you want to see the benefits from it. I suppose that's a takeaway. I think this so much wouldn't be more of a practical issue, but there's always a debate within academia regarding identity of philosophies and kind of elitism, etc. Stoicism is fairly unique. It wasn't so much into mission and proselytizing, if we can use that word, as the Epicureans were, which we might wish that they had been. One thing they were is very, very generous in their assessment of others outside of the school, other philosophies, and I argue in the book anyway, lay people. Very, very much open to. We do not have what's the word I'm looking for, but the truth isn't exclusive to us, or reason isn't exclusive to us. You can find it in other things. You look at Seneca; he quotes Epicurus, well, in the early letters anyway, all the time. Plotinus and Porphyry, they were known for being people. Cicero calls them, you know, people who love Plato. they can find things of interest all over the place. And if you look on the Facebook groups, or the groups of Stoicism where we look, I quite like actually when I see people drawing in all sorts of various themes, and I don't know. Oh, this was in a Netflix drama and someone did this, and I thought, yeah, the Stoics should actually do that. They would talk about and they would bring these things in, and they would say, that's right there, and that's actually useful. Occasionally, I see some people perhaps saying, why are you doing that? That isn't a Stoic author. I'm like, nah, the Stoics would be fine with that. They would be completely fine with you analyzing those a whole range of things. They're not like that. That puts them very different. Now contrasting with the Epicurean school, they basically had a kind of semi-religious devotion cult around Epicurus. They would celebrate his birthday, and they would have just these really kind of over-the-top descriptions of every foot he kind of takes. I follow in the steps of Epicurus, and the language, the language of it's almost like salvation, like being enlightened by Epicurus, and it's very much like that. Platonism, not to that extent. They don't have kind of cultic devotion around Plato, but still very much. He's the guy who's uncovered everything, and he's the guy we venerate. And of course, it's named after the names. Wait, Epicurus, Epicurean philosophy; Plato, Platonistic philosophy. We aren't Zenonians. We aren't. It's named after the Stoa. It in Stoicism, it isn't after the founder figure. They aren't venerated. Again, it's not, oh, we have the exclusive truth. How lucky our founder came along and told us all, or revealed this, or worked his way out to this, and no one else can come close to him. Of course, the Stoics don't say that. In fact, they don't probably even deny that Zeno was wise in the Stoic category of the word. And then, of course, Chrysippus, etc. He's very important, and Zeno and Chrysippus are cornerstones, but they're not lauded as being the be-all and the end-all. And I think within the book, that feeds into what scholars have noted. For example, there isn't much Stoic commentaries. There is around Epicureanism, there is around Platonism. Why? Because they don't venerate the writings of the founder to the extent that it's almost like scripture and we commentate upon it, and this is just all we look at. So I think with regards to my book, it kind of feeds and confirms this idea that in Stoicism, they have a very open, generous idea of where you can find useful information, and they don't think that it is just within the Stoic school. They think you can look at slaves and laborers and even the law, religion, or even our natural kind of proto-conscience. You can find things of value there, as much as they would advocate if you do want to make the best progress. Of course, Stoicism is the philosophy, and they do emphasize that, but it doesn't have this corollary position, for example, within Epicureanism, where we're every year we're having celebratory birthdays for Zeno, etc. So I think that distinguishes Stoicism, and which I think my book helps not reveal but clarify.
Great, thanks for that comprehensive answer. We've got one final question from Bob.
Yeah, I think mostly you covered, Erland, but I'll just go over it quickly. So, you know that obviously in the last 10 years or so, there's been a lot of groups popping up over the world, different Stoic groups, Stoic dating groups, Stoic groups in addiction, just main Stoic groups, discussion groups and so forth. What do you think Epictetus would think about such communities or such groups opening up?
It's hard to say. On the one hand, he kind of, and again Seneca says this as well, philosophy is kind of harmed if it exposes its charms for sale. I think that's actually Senecan language. They do believe it shouldn't be just broadly disseminated, and I think it's kind of cheapened if it is. So in that one sense, they might be a bit apprehensive. On the other thing, whether we should then read into that, well, we should be, I don't necessarily think so. There was Julia Annas noted that Epictetus had that in passing. She noticed it. My book kind of details it a bit more in depth. And Julia Annas, in passing, says, but of course, and I agree with her on this point, he's living in a very different context. we're of course, as historians, it's one of the first things we're kind of taught is contextualize things. Don't just kind of black and white contrast that. Epictetus is against that, so should we be in our context? We're of course dealing in a situation where almost everyone can read and write and understand things. We live in a democracy where we're expecting people to understand and reason through things. The other thing, and I won't spend too long on this because it can get in quite a deep discussion on this. One of the main charges against philosophers was basically that they were being like sophists, which they were the people who would use their intellect to gain money and prestige, and it was all about just vocalizing things and just making money and, well, essentially that. They wanted to protect themselves from that charge. That was kind of the big insult you could say to a philosopher: you're a sophist. You're just in it for money, and of course, if you're in it for money, you try and let everyone know, so everyone will come and listen to you. So I think that's really feeding into it as well as some traditional Greek and Roman kind of general disdain outside of philosophy as well, just against the common people. You don't do that. You don't do that. We live in very different cultural contexts, kind of the inverse. So if I was pushed on the point, I would say he'd be fine with it. If we put Epictetus, if we somehow incarnate him as a 21st century individual within our context, I think his Stoic principles and that cultural shift would mean he's probably fine with it. That said, he would probably want to emphasize, or he would emphasize, this just isn't something you come in and you look for like a meme that has a quote on it, and that's it. That's fine. You look for a weekly meme quote and off you go. It requires a bit more than that.
That's excellent, Dylan. Thanks for kind of great detail explaining it there. Thank you.
We better not promote your book there. Sorry, we better not promote your book, Erland, in case people think you're a sophist just trying to make money off this podcast.
That's true. Yeah. I'm not expecting, generally it's an academic book, so I'm not expecting it to, but if it sells well enough, it might come out in paperback, but yeah, hopefully not. Hopefully it won't be a sophist.
I'm looking forward to your next one. That'll be more for my mental capacity.
I'm looking forward to, it's actually going to be a much more enjoyable book to write. Yeah.
Looking forward to it. We've got a couple of guests on. Does anybody want to come in and ask Erland a quick question? Just unmute yourself and come in.
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me okay, Erland?
Yes, I can. Hello.
Yeah. Hi. I'm not as knowledgeable about Stoicism as Colin and Bob, but one thing that a question in the back of my mind as you've been speaking is the lay person back in the time of Epictetus, had they come across Stoicism and they wanted to learn about it, how might they have gone about that? And, would there have been a cost involved in learning? I mean, would Epictetus have been a teacher who earned a living from teaching Stoic philosophy?
It's unclear, and I think it's probably purposely unclear. Again, because philosophers are trying to not be sophists, they're a little bit cagey about saying about how they gain their money. We can look at other philosophers, Plotinus, etc. And I think I'm almost certain this would be the model. Students who were appreciative, or their family would make donations of some kind to show their appreciation, but it wouldn't be mandated. He wouldn't be someone who's in it for the money, and there'd be kind of a reciprocal exchange. It wouldn't be formal. With a sophist, they would charge fees and they would tell you what that is, but that's basically it. In the discourses, he there's a few references. He kind of makes at least implicitly, if not explicitly, to the fact that he's not living in very salubrious, posh circumstances. It refers to himself basically as an old man and stuff in a small room, I think is basically the way he kind of phrases it. So as much as he's dealing with the elite and he's surrounded by the elite, and they will be giving him some form of reimbursement, it's probably at their discretion.
Right.
Thanks, Stuart. That was excellent. We've got one more guest on. Jared, do you want to say anything?
Oh, I'm good. Hi guys, how you doing? I'm at work just now, so I'm just listening in eagerly. So all good for me. Enjoyed the discussion. Sorry for arriving late.
Okay, no worries, mate. Good to hear you. Speak to you soon, buddy. Well, that's just more or less coming up to the end of the podcast. But before we end up, could you tell us when the book's going to be available and where we can get it from?
The book, pretty much most book selling websites, Amazon, etc., Waterstones. It is an academic book. What I'm hoping is within a year or something, it will come out in paperback. If anyone knows Brian Johnson's work on Epictetus, it follows a similar path. So hopefully within a couple of years, it'll come down in price. You can get it in paperback. But yeah, Amazon, Waterstone, etc. You'll get it there.
Excellent. One final question. For any of our guests that want to contact you relating to the book or any questions, could you give us some contact details for you?
Yeah, it's my first name and last name at gmail.com. So if you're watching the video, you can just see both my names are probably unusual, but Erland MacGillivray at gmail.com, and you can reach me there. If you're on Facebook, you can message me on Facebook. Again, I think I'm the only Erland MacGillivray, so if you find me, it's me. You can message me there.
Thanks, Erland. Thanks for that excellent podcast. It's been excellent tonight, very informative. I'm sure our guests enjoyed that. We'll be on again in another couple of weeks' time with a guest still to be announced. So just hang tight, listen in, and thanks for another great podcast. Hope to see you all again soon. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Yes, thanks.
Thank you very much. It was very enjoyable. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers,
Bye-bye.
guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you.